He sat trapped in first class as his daughter screamed for hours, every polite glance turning into thinly veiled blame. Money bought better seats, bought silence, bought solutions, but not this time. Then a teenager from the back rows crossed the aisle and reached for the baby. Hands that shouldn't have known how to calm a boardroom meltdown did something no expert could. The cabin inhaled as the crying stopped, and in that stillness, a single question rose. What did that quiet moment expose about who we value and who we ignore? For the first hour of the flight, everything looked manageable. James Morrison sat with the practiced ease of a man used to solving problems quickly. His fingers dancing across the tablet screen as he flipped through notes for the meetings waiting on the other side of the Atlantic. Around him, first class hummed with its usual quiet luxury, the soft clink of crystal glasses, the rustle of premium newspapers, the muted conversations of people who had learned to speak in hushed, important tones. His daughter, Emma, slept in her bassinet beside his seat, peaceful and weightless. At 6 months old, she was a miracle he was still getting used to. Her tiny chest rose and fell with perfect rhythm. Her impossibly small fingers curled into fists against her cheeks. A quiet reminder that even high-stakes work, even billion-dollar deals, could pause for family. He allowed himself a moment of pride. His wife, Sarah, had been terrified about him flying alone with Emma. But he'd insisted he could handle it. He'd built a tech empire from nothing, navigated hostile takeovers, stared down boardrooms full of sharks. Surely he could manage one transatlantic flight with his own daughter. The cabin's ambient noise wrapped around them like a cocoon, the low drone of engines, the occasional rustle of movement, the gentle whoosh of filtered air. James returned to his notes, comfortable in the certainty that everything was under control. But certainty has a way of shattering. It started as a whimper. Then a cry. Then something far worse. One sharp wail split the cabin, piercing through the manufactured calm like a knife through silk. Then another. And another. Within minutes, the entire first-class section felt wrapped in a constant, fraying sound that seemed to burrow into everyone's bones. James moved immediately, lifting Emma from the bassinet with the careful precision he brought to everything. He tried the bottle. She turned her head away violently. He tried walking the aisle, bouncing gently the way he'd seen Sarah do 100 times. The crying intensified. He adjusted her blanket, checked her diaper, whispered to her in a tone that didn't sound like him at all, soft, pleading, desperate. None of it mattered. Her distress kept climbing, each cry building on the last until it felt like the walls themselves were vibrating with her anguish. The look started next to tea first. They came disguised as support. Tight smiles from the woman across the aisle, the kind that said, "We've all been there," while her eyes said something entirely different. A businessman too rose up, sent a subtle sigh toward his laptop screen, loud enough to be heard but quiet enough to deny. Passengers shifted in their seats with theatrical discomfort, checking watches, sending text messages, making it abundantly clear that he was disturbing a world he was supposed to fit into seamlessly. James Morrison, who commanded rooms full of investors, who had been featured on magazine covers, who could silence doubters with a single quarterly earnings report. He didn't fit here anymore, and beneath the embarrassment, beneath the growing awareness that every eye in first class was fixed on him with varying degrees of annoyance, there was something heavier pressing on his chest. Fear. His wife was recovering in a hospital bed back home. Emergency surgery, complications, a team of doctors who kept using words like stable and monitoring, words that were supposed to be reassuring but only highlighted how fragile everything had become. He had boarded this flight because the future of his company depended on meetings he couldn't delay, because investors didn't care about personal crises, because his board had made it clear that missing this summit wasn't an option. Now he couldn't even soothe his own child. Each cry felt like an indictment. Each failed attempt to comfort her was a reminder of everything he wasn't prepared for, everything his money and power couldn't solve. He was a man who hired problems away, who delegated, who moved through the world surrounded by people whose job was to make his life smoother. But there was no delegation here. No team to handle this. Just him, a screaming baby, and the suffocating weight of his own inadequacy. What James didn't know was that several rows behind him, past the curtain that separated first class from economy, someone else was listening with a different kind of attention, not annoyed, not inconvenienced, not judging, recognizing. 3 rows back in economy, 16-year-old Marcus Williams sat with his textbook spread across the tray table, though his eyes had stopped reading the pages 20 minutes ago. Instead, he listened to the crying with the sharp focus of someone who had spent years decoding that exact language. He knew the rhythm, the pitch, the breathy breaks between each desperate inhale. His little sister, Keisha, had cried like that for the first year of her life. Long, painful nights when their mother worked double shifts and Marcus became the only barrier between his sister's suffering and complete chaos. Colic, the clinic doctor had finally said, after months of his mother scraping together enough for the visit. A fancy word for pain that wouldn't stop. Marcus had learned how to read those cries the way other kids learn to read books. This wasn't hunger. This wasn't a wet diaper. This was the deep, grinding discomfort of trap gas, of an immature digestive system betraying a tiny body, of overstimulation meeting exhaustion. He could hear the baby's distress deepening with each passing minute. The frantic kicking. The exhaustion mixed with physical pain. The kind of cry that didn't stop until someone who truly understood stepped in and knew exactly what to do. But understanding was the easy part. Moving was the risk. Marcus looked down at himself. Worn jeans his mother had bought at the thrift store but insisted on pressing until they looked sharp. A clean button-up shirt that was slightly too big because he was still growing. Sneakers that were comfortable but showing their age. His backpack, sitting under the seat in front of him, was patched in 3 places with fabric tape that didn't quite match. He sat in economy surrounded by tired travelers. Budget flyers, people who counted every dollar and squeezed into middle seats to save $50. People who looked like his family, like his neighborhood, like the world he came from. First class was a different planet. Approaching the front of the plane wasn't just a walk down an aisle. It was a crossing. A boundary people pretended didn't exist but enforced with stares, suspicion, and unspoken rules. Written in a language everyone understood but no one acknowledged out loud. Marcus had lived his entire life learning how quickly good intentions could be misread when they came from someone who looked like him. How helping could become threatening. How reaching out could become trespassing. How existing in spaces not designated for him required constant calculation, constant awareness, constant proof that he belonged. He'd been followed in stores where he was just buying school supplies. He'd been stopped by security in museums he'd earned scholarships to visit. He'd seen his older brother pulled over 5 times in 1 year for matching a description that apparently just meant young, black, and driving a car someone decided he couldn't possibly afford. The lessons were clear. Stay in your lane. Don't draw attention. Don't make people uncomfortable with your presence in their spaces. Still, the crying kept drilling into the cabin, and every instinct Marcus had whispered the same truth. That baby wasn't just upset. She was in pain. Real, physical pain. And her father, despite all the obvious money, despite the first-class seat, despite whatever power he clearly had in the world, had no idea how to help her. Marcus looked down at his textbooks again. Advanced calculus. Differential equations. Competition-level problems he'd spent the last 2 years teaching himself because his under-resourced school couldn't afford a math team. Couldn't hire teachers for advanced courses. Couldn't provide the opportunities that students across town took for granted. Tomorrow he would compete in the International Youth Mathematics Competition in London. This trip was supposed to be about proving something. To the judges, to his community. To every guidance counselor who had looked at his zip code and suggested vocational school instead of college. His entire neighborhood had pulled together to send him. Church bake sales. Barbershop donations. His mother's co-workers pitching in $5 and $10 each. The weight of their hope, their investment. Their belief sat heavier on his shoulders than the backpack at his feet. But right now, all he could think about was a baby in distress and a father unraveling after nearly 2 hours of wrestling with hesitation. With fear, with the exhausting mental calculation of risk versus conscience. Marcus stood. The motion alone earned him curious glances from nearby passengers. He smoothed his shirt, straightened his shoulders, and walked up the aisle 1 row at a time. With each step, he felt the attention sharpen. Eyes tracked his movement. Passengers looked up from phones and books. The ambient suspicion thickened as he approached the curtain separating economy from first class. A flight attendant materialized in front of him, a polite wall of professionalism, her smile tight and automatic. "Can I help you find something?" she asked, her tone suggesting the only thing he should be finding was his way back to his seat. "I think I can help with the baby," Marcus said quietly, keeping his voice steady even as his heart hammered. The attendant's smile flickered. Her eyes scanned him quickly, the worn clothes, the youth, the audacity of someone from economy thinking they belonged in first class, even for a moment. "I'm sure the father has it under control," she said, her hand moving subtly to block the aisle. But before the conversation could continue, before Marcus could retreat or push forward, the father himself appeared in the aisle. James Morrison looked destroyed. His expensive shirt was rumpled and stained. His hair, usually perfect, stuck out at odd angles. His eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion and something that looked dangerously close to despair. And in his arms, Emma screamed with the kind of raw, primal distress that made people instinctively want to help or escape. James saw Marcus, saw the flight attendant blocking his path, saw the entire situation crystallize in an instant. For one tense beat, the entire cabin watched the moment play out. Every assumption, every judgment, every quiet prejudice balanced on a single decision. "Please," James said, his voice cracking. "If you think you can help." He stepped forward, closing the distance between first class and economy, between his world and Marcus's. Then he handed Emma to the teenager. The plane seemed to stop breathing. Marcus took Emma with the confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times. His hands moved with practiced precision, one supporting her head and neck, the other positioned carefully along her tiny torso. He didn't bounce her or rock her or do any of the frantic movements that James had tried. Instead, he created stillness. He held her upright against his chest, her stomach pressed gently but firmly against him. His hand moved in slow, deliberate circles along her spine, applying pressure to specific points, places where trapped gas gathered, where infant digestive system struggled, where discomfort lived. He angled her slightly, shifting her position with tiny adjustments that looked random but weren't. He'd learned this with Keisha during those endless nights, learned that sometimes babies needed gravity on their side, needed their bodies positioned just right to release whatever was causing them pain. The cabin grew silent except for Emma's crying, but even that began to change. The desperate edge softened. The frantic pitch lowered. Her rigid little body, which had been fighting against James's every attempt to soothe her, began to relax into Marcus's steady hold. He hummed, not a song, just a low, rhythmic sound that created a vibration she could feel more than hear. Another trick from those long nights with Keisha. Sound that bypassed panic and spoke directly to a baby's need for rhythm, for pattern, for something steady in a world that felt overwhelming. 30 seconds passed. A minute, then Emma burped, a small, surprisingly loud sound that would have been funny under different circumstances, and just like that, the crying stopped. Her fists, which had been clenched so tight her tiny knuckles were white, slowly uncurled. Her breathing, which had been rapid and desperate, slowed and deepened. Her eyes fluttered open, focused on the unfamiliar face above her with initial confusion, then softened into something close to calm. For the first time in over 2 hours, the cabin exhaled with her. James stood frozen, watching something he'd spent hours trying, and failing, to achieve happen in seconds. His daughter, who had been inconsolable, who had reduced him to a state of helpless panic, was peaceful in the arms of a stranger. A teenager. A kid from economy who shouldn't have known what a Manhattan executive with unlimited resources couldn't figure out. Around them, the first-class cabin underwent its own transformation. The businessman who had made his annoyance obvious earlier, who had sighed loud enough for everyone to hear, who had muttered about people who can't control their kids, lowered his gaze in visible shame. A woman who had complained under her breath about ruined flights now stared at Marcus with something between awe and disbelief. The flight attendant who had tried to redirect him back to economy stood motionless, her professional mask slipping into genuine surprise. But the most striking change came from James himself. He watched Marcus not as a stranger from the back of the plane, not as someone out of place in the polished world he inhabited, but as someone who carried a skill born from love, from struggle, from lived experience he couldn't begin to understand. "How did you?" James started, then stopped, realizing how inadequate the question was. Marcus looked up, still holding Emma, still maintaining that careful stillness. "I have a baby sister. She had colic bad for about a year. You learn to read what they need. The simplicity of it landed like a revelation. No special training. No expensive consultants. Just necessity, repetition, and love practiced over countless exhausting nights that wealth couldn't buy a shortcut through. I've been trying everything, James said quietly. Bottles, walking, changing her position. Nothing worked. Sometimes it's not about doing more, Marcus said gently. It's about creating stillness so they can work through it. The rocking and bouncing can make it worse when their stomach hurts. They need steady pressure, gentle gravity, time to process. Emma yawned, a tiny, perfectly timed gesture that made several nearby passengers smile despite themselves. Would you? Could you show me? James asked, and there was something in his voice that went beyond gratitude. Something like humility. Like the recognition that expertise doesn't always come from the places we've been taught to look. Of course, Marcus said. What happened next surprised everyone, including both of them. James didn't retreat to his seat with his now calm daughter. Instead, he invited Marcus to sit in the empty first-class seat beside him, a seat that cost more than Marcus's entire trip to London. The flight attendant started to intervene, then caught James's expression and backed away. For the next hour, as Emma slept peacefully between them, they talked. James learned that Marcus wasn't just a kid on a plane. He was one of 50 students selected worldwide for the International Youth Mathematics Competition, an achievement that required not just brilliance but relentless self-teaching. His school didn't have advanced placement courses, didn't have math teams, didn't have the resources that schools in wealthier districts took for granted. I taught myself mostly online, Marcus explained. MIT has free courseware. Khan Academy. YouTube lectures from professors at universities I'll probably never attend. I'd stay up after my shifts at the grocery store, after helping Keisha with homework, after making sure my mom had dinner ready when she got home from her second job. James listened, really listened, in a way he couldn't remember doing in years. His world was filled with people pitching him, people agreeing with him, people telling him what he wanted to hear. This was different. This was honest, unfiltered reality from a life he'd never had to imagine. The whole neighborhood raised money to send me, Marcus continued, his voice carrying both pride and pressure. Church bake sales. The barbershop ran a donation jar for 6 months. My mom's co-workers at the hospital did a fundraiser. This trip represents hope for a lot of people back home. That's incredible, James said, and meant it. The competition. What's your focus area? Number theory and algebraic geometry, Marcus said, a hint of enthusiasm breaking through his careful composure. I'm working on a proof related to prime distribution patterns. It's probably not original. Someone at Princeton probably solved it 30 years ago, but I want to see if I can get there on my own. For the first time since Emma's crying started, James felt something shift inside him. He was sitting next to someone whose raw intellectual firepower could rival anyone in his company, anyone in his network, anyone in the elite universities where he recruited. Someone whose potential was being constrained not by ability but by access. Where are you hoping to go to college? James asked. Marcus's expression tightened slightly. Anywhere that'll give me enough financial aid. I've got decent test scores, but college, that's a whole different level of expensive. Even state schools require money we don't have. The conversation could have ended there. Should have ended there, in the way most encounters between different worlds end, with polite acknowledgement, with best wishes, with both parties returning to their separate spheres. But Emma stirred, made a small sound, and Marcus's hand moved automatically to steady her with the same practiced care he'd shown before. And James found himself asking, what if you had access to the resources you needed? The courses, the mentorship, the network. What would you do? Marcus looked at him carefully, reading the question for its deeper implications. I'd do what I'm already doing, he said. But faster. Better. And I'd figure out how to bring those resources back to my community. Teaching programs. Math clubs for kids who don't have them. Making sure the next Marcus doesn't have to teach himself everything from YouTube. The answer was perfect, not because it was calculated to impress, but because it was true. James pulled out his phone. Can I get your email? The rest of the flight unfolded in a way that felt both unexpected and inevitable. James didn't sleep. Instead, he asked questions, listened to answers, and found himself confronting assumptions he didn't even know he'd been carrying. He learned about resource deserts masquerading as schools, about teachers who cared but were overwhelmed, about students like Marcus who had to choose between working to help families survive and pursuing education that might lift them all eventually, about communities that pulled their poverty to invest in a rare success story, hoping it would become a bridge to something better. Marcus, meanwhile, found himself in close proximity to a world he'd only seen from a distance. He listened to James talk about his company, about decision-making at scale, about the machinery of wealth and power that shapes society from boardrooms and investment portfolios. But Marcus didn't let the luxury distract him or intimidate him. His mind stayed focused on the competition ahead, on the problems he'd been working through, on the dreams that had gotten him this FA.as. The plane began its descent into London. James said something that surprised them both. "I don't want to rescue you." Marcus looked at him, waiting. "I've seen it before," James continued. "Rich guy meets talented kid from tough circumstances, swoops in like a savior, puts their name on a scholarship fund, feels good about themselves. The kid becomes a story the rich guy tells at dinner parties. It's gross, patronizing. It centers the wrong person." Marcus nodded slowly, appreciating the honesty. "But I do want to invest in you," James continued. "And I mean invest in the real sense. Not charity. Partnership. You have something most people I work with don't. Real skills, real drive, and real perspective on problems I should be solving but probably don't even see. I'd like to offer you a summer position at my company. Paid well. Working with our data science team. And if you're interested, I'll connect you with people at universities I work with, not to pull strings, but to make sure your application gets seen by humans who'll recognize what you've accomplished." He paused, then added, "No strings. No expectations that you'll be grateful. No ownership of your story. Just access to resources that should have been available to you from the start." Marcus sat with that for a long moment. He thought about his mother, working doubles. About Keisha, counting on her big brother to show her what was possible. About his neighborhood, invested in him in ways that went far beyond money. "I need to think about it," Marcus said finally. "Not because I'm not grateful, but because everything I've accomplished, I did with my community behind me. I need to make sure whatever I do honors that I don't leave people behind." "That's exactly the kind of thinking I'm talking about," James said, and there was genuine respect in his voice. "Take your time. The offer stands." The math competition came and went, and Marcus rose to the top with the same clarity and precision he'd shown on the plane. 3rd place overall. First among US participants. Scholarship offers from 3 universities materialized within weeks, not because of James's influence, but because his accomplishments finally had the visibility they deserved. He accepted James's summer position. Not because he needed saving, but because he had earned the opportunity to work with the data science team and challenge them in ways they didn't expect, asking questions about algorithmic bias, about whose problems technology was solving, about the gap between innovation and equity. He didn't just accept the world of wealth and power he'd stepped into. He disrupted it, politely but firmly, with perspective it desperately needed, and James changed too. He couldn't unsee what that flight had shown him. His company launched an initiative recruiting directly from under-resourced schools, not as charity, but as deliberate strategy to find talent the traditional pipeline was missing. He funded math programs in communities like Marcus's, not with his name on the building, but with resources that actually worked. More importantly, he learned to parent differently. He called Marcus once, months later, sheepishly asking for advice about Emma's sleep schedule. They laughed about it. About how a billionaire had to call a teenager for parenting help. About how the most valuable expertise often lives in the most unexpected places. The story of that flight eventually made its way through both their worlds. In Marcus's neighborhood, it became proof of what they'd always known, that brilliance lived everywhere, just waiting for a chance to show itself. In James's circles, it became an uncomfortable reminder of how many capable people they dismissed, overlooked, or never even encountered because of geography, income, or skin color. But for both of them, the real shift had happened in that moment on the plane. not when the baby stopped crying, but in everything that followed. When Marcus had crossed that invisible boundary between economy and first class, he'd done more than help a crying baby. He'd disrupted assumptions, challenged prejudices, and proven what's possible when people see each other clearly, without the distortion of wealth, without the barriers of bias, without the comfortable distance that lets us ignore each other's humanity. And James, stripped of his certainty and control by a screaming infant, had found something more valuable than any deal he'd ever closed: humility, perspective, and the recognition that expertise doesn't always come from the places we've been trained to look. Sometimes it comes from 3 rows back. From a teenager with patched sneakers and wisdom earned through necessity. Sometimes the smallest act, steady hands on a crying child, reveals everything about the worlds we come from, the assumptions we carry, and the futures we all deserve. As Marcus's plane crossed back over the Atlantic months later, returning from another competition he'd won, he thought about that first flight, about the fear he'd felt walking up that aisle, about the risk of being seen as threatening when he was only trying to help, about how close he'd come to staying silent, and about what would have been lost if he had, not just for Emma or James, but for himself. Because sometimes courage isn't loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's a 16-year-old standing up, crossing a boundary he wasn't supposed to cross, and trusting that his humanity would be recognized instead of feared. Sometimes it's reaching out when every lesson you've learned tells you to pull back, and sometimes, just sometimes, the world reaches back.